Hello, friend, and welcome back. If this brings you peace, consider subscribing. It helps me keep making these stories for you. Tonight, I invite you to dim your lights, settle in, and take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders sink into the pillow or the chair, and let your mind begin to soften around the edges. This is not a story meant to thrill you or startle you awake. Instead, it's a long, meandering path through the dusty corridors of history. Our subject is not kings or heroes, but rather the quieter figures who made up so much of the ancient world, the slaves of Greece, and all the odd corners of their lives. Now, I should warn you, this is not a tale of glamorous battles or lofty poetry. This is about what it was actually like to be a slave in a society that many still think of as the birthplace of democracy and philosophy. And here's the first little irony. The very same Athens that gave us Socrates and Plato, the city that staged plays still read today, also ran on a system where as many as 1 in 3 people were enslaved. Imagine that for a moment. Every time a torch was lit in an Athenian home, every time a banquet was laid out, every time someone went to the Agra to buy figs or fish, there was most likely a slave quietly making it happen. Picture this with me. The warm, chalky dust of a late afternoon clings to your sandals. You're following your master, carrying a basket of olives and bread. Your tunic is rough, the kind of fabric that scratches the skin, nothing like the softer weaves the wealthy wore. People pass you in the street, and most don't even glance at you. You are background, like the sound of doves cooing from the rooftops or the smell of garlic from the bakeries. You exist, but only as part of someone else's shadow. And yet, in a strange way, you are indispensable. Greek society leaned heavily on slave labor. There were household slaves, of course, scrubbing the floors with water and sand until their hands were raw. There were field slaves, bent under the sun, coaxing olives and grapes from stony soil. There were skilled slaves, too, men who could carve wood or shape metal, who made the everyday objects that people used without thinking. A few even worked in dangerous silver mines, lungs filling with dust in dark tunnels, earning fortunes for their owners, but nothing for themselves. The thing about Greek slavery is that it wasn't always simple. You weren't enslaved just because of skin color or one particular ethnicity. You might have been captured in war, torn from your home in Thrace or Lydia. You might have been born into slavery, your mother a servant in some Athenian household. You might have been kidnapped by pirates on the Aegean Sea. Pirates were very fond of that trade, because a living person was often more profitable than any pile of stolen goods. It was a patchwork system, stitched together from conquest, commerce and cruelty. Now, daily life for a slave depended a great deal on luck. Some lived in cramped servants' quarters, sleeping on straw, rising before dawn to fetch water. Others had slightly more comfortable positions, working as tutors for wealthy children if they were educated, or as scribes in bustling workshops. But no matter the task, the constant truth was that your life did not belong to you. You could be bought, sold, punished, or even freed, depending entirely on your owner's mood and resources. And yes, there was the possibility of manumission, being freed, but let's not romanticize it too much. Freedom usually came with strings attached, debts of loyalty or the obligation to keep serving in some way. Let me give you an image to hold on to. Imagine a young slave boy running errands in the streets of Athens. The sun bakes the marble columns until they glow faintly golden. Vendors call out with sing-song voices about their fresh figs, their salted fish. Somewhere nearby, a philosopher is lecturing, words rising into the warm air. The boy weaves through the crowd, clutching a jug of wine for his master. He is fast, clever, and unnoticed. He may one day grow old in this city and never have the right to call it his own. Some philosophers of the time did speak about slavery, but not in the way you might hope. Aristotle famously argued that some people were natural slaves, destined by their very essence to serve others. It sounds harsh to us now, but back then it was just one more way of making the whole system seem normal. And yet, for all that theory, there were always whispers of unease. Comedies on the Athenian stage sometimes made jokes about slaves being cleverer than their masters. And ordinary citizens, when they saw a slave in the marketplace who spoke their language fluently, who dressed not so differently, must have felt that uneasy little thought, this could have been me. Life was not all chains and whips, but it wasn't freedom either. It was something in between, a life lived in the margins. Some slaves could marry, though their unions were not legally recognized. Some could save small sums of money if their masters allowed it. Some might even become trusted managers of estates or businesses. But at any moment, all of that could be taken away. A careless word, a failed task, and punishment could come swiftly. And what of the night? When the lamps burned low, when even the owls on the Acropolis grew quiet, slaves lay down on their mats or straw, and perhaps dreamed of home. Maybe they remembered the voice of a mother, speaking a different tongue, or the taste of bread baked in a faraway hearth. The human heart, after all, does not forget where it came from. Even in Athens, even under the shadow of democracy, people longed for a freedom that might never arrive. But what did slaves eat, you might wonder? What fueled the endless labor of carrying water, grinding grain, and polishing stone? That's what we'll explore in the next part, as we step into the kitchens and hearths of ancient Greece and taste what life might have offered, both for masters and for the people who served them. Food has a way of telling the truth about a society. So let us wander gently into the kitchens of ancient Greece, where smoke curls up from clay hearths and the smell of bread lingers in the air. For a slave, food was both sustenance and a reminder of place. You didn't eat at the table with your master, unless you were serving there. You ate behind, or after, or out in the courtyard, with whatever portions were given to you. The staple food was bread. Not the soft, fluffy loaves we know today, but heavy, coarse bread made from barley, or sometimes wheat. Barley was cheaper, more filling, but harder on the teeth. Imagine chewing something that felt halfway between bread and gravel. Slaves might joke among themselves about whether their bread had been baked with actual stones inside, because sometimes it felt like it. A common phrase at the time even described bad bread as breaking the jaw. Alongside the bread came porridge, another humble staple. Grains boiled in water until they were soft, flavored maybe with a little oil if you were lucky, or onions if the kitchen had some to spare. Protein was harder to come by. Meat was a luxury, often reserved for religious sacrifices and feasts. When it did come, slaves might get the less appealing cuts, fatty, stringy, or simply boiled into a communal stew. Fish, on the other hand, was abundant in the coastal markets. Salted fish especially was a cheap and popular choice. Slaves who worked in the kitchens would salt barrels of fish, the smell seeping into their clothes until it followed them everywhere. Garlic, too, was common, crushed and mixed with oil to give flavor to otherwise plain meals. A little garlic, a little olive oil, and suddenly the porridge was bearable. Imagine now a group of household slaves in the late evening. They gather in the courtyard after the family's dinner. There are leftover scraps of bread, a little porridge, maybe the bones of a fish with bits of meat clinging to it. They sit together, cross-legged, sharing what they can. The night is cool, the stars clear above the tiled roofs, and for a brief moment, the day's toil is softened by the comfort of eating side by side. Wine was another constant presence. Not the robust, deep reds we imagine today, a thinner wine, often mixed with water. Masters drank it with their meals, but slaves too might sip the diluted versions, especially when water was unsafe. The Greeks were suspicious of anyone who drank wine unmixed, calling it barbaric. So even the humblest worker might lift a clay cup of watered wine at the end of the day, letting the sour tang ease the ache in their bones. Food wasn't just fuel. It was also a line drawn between classes. A master might enjoy honey cakes, delicate cheese, or roasted meats during a feast, while the slaves hovered nearby, filling cups, carrying platters, watching the food pass them by. The scents must have been overwhelming, the sweet richness of honey, the sizzling fat of lamb on a spit. And yet, those serving rarely tasted more than a stray crumb or a scrap left behind. Still, there were moments of joy. Festivals, for instance, were times when slaves might receive extra food, sometimes even the same dishes as their masters. The Dionysia, with its celebration of wine and theater, was one such occasion. On those nights, laughter might echo through the streets, music drifting from flutes, and even slaves could briefly taste the pleasures of roasted meat and sweet wine. A holiday from hunger, if only for a little while. And food carried stories. A Thracian slave might tell others about the sour milk of his homeland. A woman taken from Lydia might describe spices unknown in Athens. Around the humble shared bowls, memories of faraway kitchens flickered to life, reminding them that the world was wider than the walls of their master's home. If you've ever eaten leftovers cold from the fridge at midnight, you've tasted a little of what they felt making do, turning scraps into a small kind of comfort. History is full of grand banquets, but it is in the simple meals of the forgotten where the heart beats steady. But what about the work itself, the endless rhythm of labor? The jobs that filled every hour of the day? That is where we'll walk next, into the bustling workshops, fields and mines of Greece, to see what it truly meant to spend a lifetime in service. Now that we've filled our stomachs with bread and porridge, let us step back out into the sunlight of daily labor. Because food was only one side of life for a Greek slave. The other, much heavier side, was work. From dawn until long after dusk, the rhythm of a slave's life was the rhythm of toil. Imagine it for a moment. The cock crows in the gray half-light before sunrise. And already you are awake, pulling on the same rough tunic as yesterday, heading to whatever duty was yours. Some slaves worked in the fields. Their hands were cracked and stained from soil and sap. The air was sharp with the smell of olive trees, pungent and resinous, or with the sweeter perfume of grapevines. They bent low, plucking weeds, pruning branches, harvesting olives by hand, and carrying them in woven baskets. Summer heat pressed like a heavy blanket, and winter winds cut through thin clothing. There was no choice, no escape, just the endless cycle of seasons. The reward was not the fruit itself, but simply survival. Because the olives and grapes became oil and wine, profits flowing upward to the master. Others worked indoors in households, and their duties could be equally relentless. A young girl might spend hours grinding grain with a stone quern, her shoulders aching, the sound of stone on stone filling the little room. Another might haul water from a fountain, balancing jars on her head until her neck ached. A boy could be sent running errands all day, weaving through crowded streets to deliver messages, carry purchases, or fetch tools. Work did not pause when the body grew weary. There was always more to do. And then there were the workshops. Athens especially thrived on craft and trade, and many slaves became the backbone of those industries. Picture the clang of hammer on bronze in a smithy, sparks leaping like fireflies. Or the smell of leather soaking in vats, dyes staining water crimson or indigo. Slaves tanned hides, spun wool, carved wood, even copied manuscripts if they were literate. Some were highly skilled artisans, but still they labored not for themselves, but for their owners. Their hands shaped beauty, but their names rarely survived. Perhaps the harshest labor of all was in the silver mines of Laurion, south of Athens. Narrow tunnels were hacked into the earth, dark and choking with dust. Slaves worked by lamplight, the air heavy and stale, the constant risk of collapse always present. Children were used here too, small enough to crawl through tight spaces. The wealth of Athens, its grand temples, its ships, its democracy, was funded in no small part by silver pulled from these mines by enslaved hands. The irony is bitter. The cradle of democracy rocked gently on the backs of those who had no voice at all. Punishments for mistakes were ever present. A broken pot, a spilled jug of oil, a task done too slowly, any of these could bring a beating. Some masters were harsher than others, and stories spread among slaves of those who treated their workers cruelly. But even the kindest master still held ultimate power. To live as a slave was to live under the constant weight of someone else's decision. Yet there were odd moments of humanity too. A slave who managed a household might be trusted with keys and accounts, given responsibilities that hinted at respect. A nurse who raised a master's child might form a bond so deep that, in quiet moments, the lines between servant and family blurred. Life was complicated that way pain and tenderness woven together. Never equal, but always tangled. Imagine a bustling Athenian street at midday. The air is filled with the sound of merchants shouting, the smell of fish and garlic, the bleating of goats. Slaves rush through, some carrying baskets of figs, others shouldering amphorae of wine. One man wipes sweat from his brow as he hurries with a message for his master. Another limps from an old injury, still forced to carry heavy loads. Their eyes meet briefly, a flicker of shared understanding. In that glance lies a universe, endurance, weariness, and a spark of solidarity. What's remarkable is how invisible slaves often were in the daily stories of the Greeks themselves. The plays, the poems, the speeches, they mention slaves, yes, but often as background characters, comic relief, or convenient foils. Real slaves, with their quiet sufferings and fleeting joys, passed mostly unrecorded. But history whispers their presence all the same. And then there is the question of freedom. For some slaves, there was always the faint hope that, through loyalty or years of service, they might be granted manumission. A master might free a slave in his will, or reward one who had served faithfully. Freedmen, as they were called, could live as citizens in some cities, though often with limited rights. But freedom was never guaranteed, and for most, it remained only a dream. Like a star glimpsed in the distance beautiful, but out of reach. Think about how much work defines identity today. We ask each other, "What do you do?" as if the answer explains the person. In ancient Greece, for slaves, the answer was already decided. You do whatever you are told. And that loss of choice, of self-direction, was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. As twilight fell, the work did not always stop. Lamps were lit, shadows danced on plaster walls, and slaves continued their duties until their masters retired. Only then could they find a moment to rest, sitting on straw mats, rubbing sore muscles, whispering to one another in the dark. And in those whispers, perhaps, they spoke of other things, stories of their homelands, rumors of battles, faint glimmers of hope. But what about when night truly fell? What happened when the city quieted, when torches burned low, when fear of the dark pressed in? That is where we turn next, into the shadows of the night, to see what rest, dreams, and dangers awaited the forgotten souls of Greece. And now, as the sun sets behind the hills of Attica and the marble of the Acropolis glows in fading gold, we step softly into the night. For slaves, the hours after dusk were not always a reprieve, but they carried a different rhythm, quieter, slower, filled with both rest and unease. Imagine the last chores of the day being finished, the embers raked together in the kitchen hearth, the amphorae sealed, the courtyard swept one last time. Shadows stretch long across the walls, and the air cools just enough to make the skin shiver. This was when the city hushed, and the lives of slaves folded into a fragile pause. Sleep itself was rarely luxurious. Few had proper beds. Instead, straw mats on hard floors were the norm, sometimes in the corners of storerooms, sometimes in small servants' quarters, tucked at the back of a house. The mats smelled faintly of dust and old grain, prickling against the skin. Some slaves might curl under thin wool blankets if they were lucky, but many slept with only their tunics for warmth. Picture yourself lying down after a long day of labor, bones aching, eyes heavy, with the faint sound of night insects outside and the creak of wood settling in the beams above. Privacy was nearly non-existent. In wealthier homes, there could be dozens of slaves, and they often slept crowded together. The night air filled with the soft chorus of breathing, occasional murmurs, and the rustle of shifting bodies. For some, this closeness was a comfort, the warmth of others pressed close against the cold. But for others, it was another reminder of how little space belonged to them alone. Your life, your labor, even your dreams were not truly your own, and yet dreams were a secret rebellion. Imagine a Thracian slave dreaming of the snowy forests of his homeland, where pine needles crackled underfoot and wolves howled in the distance. Or a woman from Asia Minor, drifting into memories of a bustling harbor, the smell of salt and spices filling her nostrils once more. Dreams stitched fragments of freedom together, offering a fleeting escape from reality. No master could fully command the private theater of the mind. But night was not always peaceful. Darkness carried its own dangers. Patrols roamed the streets, and curfews in cities like Athens restricted movement. A slave caught outside at night without permission could be beaten or worse. Inside households, some slaves remained on duty through the night, guarding the door or tending fires so the embers would not die. Others served as watchmen over storerooms, ensuring that valuables were not stolen. For those assigned to such tasks, sleep came in shifts, brief and restless. There was also fear of punishment. The night hours gave masters time to reflect on the day, and sometimes that reflection led to anger carried out before bed. A careless word spoken in daylight might result in a whipping by torchlight. The uncertainty made every evening tense. You never knew if rest would be uninterrupted or shattered by harsh commands. Still, there were softer moments. A nurse might cradle the child she raised, humming a lullaby in a language not her own, the melody drifting into the shadows. In the quiet of the courtyard, a stable hand might whisper to the horses, stroking their manes, feeling the steady warmth of creatures who never judged him. Sometimes slaves would murmur to one another in the dark, trading fragments of stories, or even sharing a joke. A quiet laugh, muffled under breath, could ripple through the straw mats like a tiny spark of light in the gloom. Imagine standing on the rooftop at night, a forbidden but irresistible venture. The city below lies silent. The Aegean glimmers with reflected starlight, and the outline of distant mountains rises black against the sky. You breathe deeply, filling your lungs with cool night air, and for a moment it feels like you belong to the vast world rather than to the narrow walls of servitude. But then footsteps echo from the courtyard below, and you hurry back down, heart pounding, reminded of your place. Some nights carried the sounds of celebration. Festivals, weddings, or feasts in wealthy homes meant music drifting through the streets, the high notes of flutes and the deep pulse of drums. Slaves served late into those nights, balancing trays of food, refilling cups, watching as their masters laughed, argued, and danced. And when the revelry grew too loud, sometimes a slave would catch a stray grape or crust of bread thrown aside, tasting joy secondhand. It wasn't much, but in the dark hours, even scraps could feel golden. Superstition, too, shaped the night. Greeks believed in spirits and omens, and slaves, like everyone else, felt the pull of these beliefs. A flicker of a torch could seem like a sign. A sudden owl's cry might be read as a warning. In the silence of midnight, when the mind wandered and shadows seemed to move on their own. It was easy to imagine unseen forces walking beside you. For a slave who had no power, sometimes such beliefs gave meaning. Sometimes they added fear, but either way they filled the darkness with stories. And as sleep deepened, the city itself joined in. The clamor of daytime markets faded to silence. The smell of garlic and fish gave way to damp stone and cool earth. Torches burned low, leaving streets in shadow. Somewhere far away, the sea sighed against the shore. This was the backdrop against which slaves dreamed, worried, and rested a world that offered no true rest, but at least a pause. If you close your eyes now, you might hear it. The hush of an ancient night, the sound of breathing from a crowded room, the creak of wooden shutters in the breeze. You might imagine yourself lying on that scratchy mat, heavy with weariness, hoping for one stretch of dreamless sleep before dawn pulled you back to labor. But what happened when the sun returned? When the city awoke again and life resumed? What rituals, what customs, what small amusements filled the days of both master and servant alike? That is where we'll wander next, into the rituals of daily life, where slaves were both essential actors and invisible shadows in the theater of Greek society. With dawn creeping over the tiled rooftops of Athens, the quiet of the night dissolves into the steady hum of life once more. The city stirs, a mixture of chatter, footsteps, and the bray of donkeys. Slaves, as always, were among the first to rise. Their lives were woven into the daily rituals of Greek households, from the smallest chores to the grandest ceremonies, though rarely were they acknowledged as anything more than part of the machinery of daily life. Morning began with the rekindling of the hearth fire, the center of every home. For Greeks, the hearth was sacred, tied to the goddess Hestia. But it was not the master who crouched with tinder and kindling, coaxing flame from glowing embers. It was a slave, blowing gently, face smudged with ash, fingers stiff from cold. The family would later gather around that fire to eat, but the slave tended it unseen, ensuring the day began as it should. Household rituals extended to the shrine as well. Many Greek homes kept a small altar with offerings to the household gods. Fresh fruit, a splash of wine, or a pinch of grain might be placed there. Yet often it was the slave who carried out the ritual acts. Imagine being forced to kneel before gods who were not your own, to offer prayers in a language not native to your childhood, all the while knowing that the divine offerings came from a household that owned you. And yet, some slaves found comfort in these rituals, adopting the gods of their masters, blending them with the half-remembered deities of their homelands. Religion was both an obligation and a fragile thread of hope. Bathing was another daily custom, and it revealed stark contrasts. Wealthy citizens might visit public baths or enjoy private facilities, while slaves washed quickly at fountains or with basins of cold water, often before the city even woke. For the wealthy, bathing was ritual and refreshment. For slaves, it was brisk necessity, often done in silence, with no time to linger. The rituals of work were repetitive, but strangely ceremonial. A kitchen slave knew every movement of preparing bread, grinding the grain, kneading the dough, tending the fire. A stable hand brushed horses in long, practiced strokes, murmuring softly to calm them. A nurse rocked a child with steady rhythm, her voice weaving lullabies that mixed languages and melodies from faraway lands. These daily actions, though unremarkable to the masters, carried patterns that gave shape to a life that otherwise belonged to others. There were also community rituals in the city at large. Festivals, sacrifices, processions all filled the streets with color and music. Slaves were both participants and laborers. During the Panathenaia, Athens' grand festival, honoring Athena, slaves prepared the offerings, wove the cloth for the goddess's statue, and carried supplies for the citizens who marched in the procession. Imagine standing in the throng, flute music shrill in the air, the smell of roasting meat drifting from the altars, and feeling both part of the spectacle and forever outside it. Entertainment filtered into daily life in quieter ways. Storytelling, for instance, was a ritual that transcended class. Around the hearth, slaves might overhear epic tales of Homer recited by their masters, stories of Achilles' wrath or Odysseus' wanderings. Later, in their own quarters, they might retell those stories in whispers, mixing them with the legends of their own homelands. One could imagine a Thracian slave embellishing Odysseus' adventures with details from northern myths, weaving two cultures into a tapestry of survival through story. Laughter, too, had its rituals. Greek comedies often portrayed slaves as clever tricksters, outwitting their masters or playing the fool. In the theaters, slaves might accompany their masters and stand at the edges, listening as the audience roared with laughter at jokes about people like them. The irony was sharp, but perhaps in the shadows, a slave smiled too, savoring the rare moment when the powerful were mocked. Humor, after all, needs no citizenship. Meals formed another rhythm of daily ritual. Masters and their guests reclined at symposia, sipping wine, listening to music, and debating philosophy. Slaves moved silently around them, filling cups, clearing plates, tending lamps. They did not partake in the intellectual sparring or the luxuries of roasted meats and honeyed cakes. But when the symposium ended, the scraps left behind became their small feast. What was extravagance to one was survival to another. Yet in both cases, food and drink marked the turning of the day. Education itself carried rituals, and here again, slaves were present. Wealthy children were escorted to their tutors by slaves called pedagogoi. These attendants carried books, enforced discipline, and often spent more time with the children than their parents did. Picture a small boy dragging his feet on the way to lessons, tugging at the hand of the older slave walking beside him. The slave scolds him gently, reminding him of letters and numbers. The boy may become a citizen, a soldier, perhaps even a statesman, while the slave will remain forever in the shadows. And yet, in those shared walks, a strange bond could form. Daily repetition made them part of each other's stories, even if history never noticed. Religious festivals were the high points of communal life, and slaves were not excluded entirely. Some were given small freedoms during these times, even allowed to mingle more freely in the streets. On those days, the ordinary rhythms of grinding, sweeping, and fetching were replaced with music, laughter, and processions. For a moment, the hierarchy softened, though it never disappeared. Imagine the joy of dancing at the edge of a festival crowd, feeling the pulse of drums in your chest, tasting wine you didn't have to steal, and letting yourself forget, if only briefly, the chains that bound your day's dot. And yet, once the festivals ended, normalcy returned. The hearth fire needed tending. The floors needed sweeping. Rituals, customs, amusements, they were threads woven tightly around the structure of Greek society, and slaves were both the weavers and the fabric. Invisible, indispensable, always present dot as the day wore on. Shadows lengthened again. The marketplace emptied, workshops closed their shutters, and torches flickered to life once more. Rituals of work gave way again to rituals of rest, and the cycle continued. But what about the moments of punishment, rebellion, and resistance? Did slaves ever push back, even in small ways, against the weight of their chains? In the next chapter, we'll step quietly into the world of discipline, defiance, and the fragile sparks of resistance that flickered within Greek slavery. Punishment, discipline, and the quiet undercurrent of resistance. These were the shadows that followed every Greek slave as faithfully as their own footsteps. For no matter how many rituals ordered the day, or how many tasks kept their hands busy, the possibility of punishment was always near. It was a constant presence, like the crackle of fire in the hearth or the smell of dust on the wind. And yet, within that harshness, there were also whispers of defiance, of cleverness, of resilience that slipped past the notice of their masters. Imagine the scene of a household courtyard in Athens. A master stands tall, arms folded, displeased with some mistake. Perhaps the wine jar cracked, spilling its precious contents. Perhaps a garment was stained or a task left undone. The slave stands silent, eyes lowered, waiting. Punishment might be swift, a slap, a blow, a harsh word. In worse cases, beatings with a rod or a lash. The Greeks believed discipline kept slaves obedient, a necessary measure to remind them of their status. Aristotle himself wrote that fear was the natural bond between master and slave, a chilling reflection of how normalized cruelty could become. But punishment was not only physical. Humiliation could be its own weapon. A master might force a slave to perform menial tasks in front of guests, mocking them, reducing them further in the eyes of others. Some slaves were branded, marked permanently as property, a sign burned into their flesh. Imagine carrying that scar for life, knowing every glance at it was a reminder of your lack of freedom. Yet, within this framework of control, slaves still found ways to resist. Some resistance was quiet and small, the kind that slips under notice. A task done slowly, stretching minutes into hours. A pot cracked accidentally. A message delayed. These little acts might seem insignificant, but to the person carrying them out, they were small rebellions, reminders that even under chains, one could still exercise some control. Other resistance was more daring. Slaves sometimes ran away, fleeing into the countryside, hoping to vanish among strangers or return to distant homelands. Athens even had a sanctuary at the temple of Theseus, where runaway slaves could seek protection, appealing for a change of master. But escape was fraught with risk. Without citizenship papers, without support, a runaway could be captured easily, punished severely, or sold to harsher labor. The dream of freedom often collided with the reality of survival. Rebellions on a larger scale were rare in Greece, nothing like the famous slave uprisings in Rome, such as Spartacus's revolt. Still, there are hints in history of collective unrest. In the mines of Lorien, for example, where conditions were brutal, scholars suspect that groups of slaves sometimes staged work slowdowns or attempted escapes together. The thought of men and children crawling through narrow tunnels in the dark, whispering plans of rebellion, carries a haunting weight. Even laughter could be a form of resistance. Think of the comedies where slaves were portrayed as clever tricksters. On stage, they mocked their masters, outwitted the pompous, and made fools of the powerful. Though these were only plays, they carried an edge of truth. A slave watching from the sidelines could laugh quietly, knowing that in some small way, the jokes shifted power. Humor was a safety valve, a way to turn the heaviness of life into something momentarily lighter. There were also stories of loyalty, oddly enough, because human relationships are never simple. A slave might protect their master in battle, might nurse them through illness, might even sacrifice themselves. Was this loyalty freely given, or forged by necessity and dependence? History rarely tells us, but we can imagine the complicated emotions at play. A nurse who raised a child from infancy might love that child deeply, even while knowing she was still a slave. Bonds formed in the cracks of oppression, fragile and contradictory. Still, the threat of punishment hung overhead like a storm cloud. Whippings were common enough that some households kept designated whips or rods ready. The law even permitted a master to torture a slave if their testimony was required in court, because Greeks believed slaves would only tell the truth under pain. Imagine the terror of being forced into that role. Your body used as a tool of the justice system. Your words carrying weight only when extracted by violence. And yet, the spirit of resistance endures in even the smallest gestures. A whispered story in the dark, a stolen moment of rest, a joke shared at a master's expense. These are the ways people held onto fragments of dignity. Even under strict control, humanity finds cracks to grow through, like grass pushing up between stones. If you close your eyes now, you might picture a young slave kneeling after a beating, back aching, hands trembling. His master walks away, satisfied. But inside, the boy whispers a vow to himself, words no one else can hear, a promise to endure, to remember, to keep something of himself untouched by chains. That secret vow is resistance too, though it leaves no trace in records, no lines in chronicles. But punishment was not the only shadow over a slave's life. There was also the role they played in myths, in stories, in the cultural imagination of the Greeks themselves. Slaves appear not just in households and workshops, but in the tales told by poets and playwrights. And those stories, strange as they may seem, shaped how people thought about slavery, blending cruelty with comedy, power with parody. So what about those myths and stories? How did Greek imagination paint the lives of slaves? And what can we hear when we listen to those echoes on the stage? That is where we'll wander next, into the plays, the legends, and the curious ways slaves became both invisible and unforgettable in Greek culture. When we speak of ancient Greece, we so often think of myths, plays, and stories. These were not only entertainment, but the cultural glue that bound people together, whispered into the ears of children at night, performed in great theaters, retold in marketplaces. And even here, in this world of imagination and narrative, slaves had their roles. They might not have shaped the stories, but the stories shaped how others thought about them, and perhaps how they thought of themselves. Greek comedies, in particular, are where slaves most often appear. Playwrights like Aristophanes loved to use slave characters as comic relief, quick-witted servants who outwitted their masters, or bumbling fools who created chaos with their mistakes. In a way, it was the ancient version of sitcom humor, the clever underdog making the powerful look silly. Imagine the stage of an open-air theater, thousands of citizens gathered under the sunlight, their laughter echoing as a slave character delivers a sly line that skewers the arrogance of an Athenian noble. The audience laughs, masters and slaves alike, but perhaps for different reasons. The citizens laugh at the absurdity. The slaves perhaps laugh at the tiny rebellion embedded in the joke. Tragedy, however, treated slaves differently. In plays by Euripides or Sophocles, slaves sometimes appeared as messengers, bringing news from distant places, or as loyal attendants whose voices framed the drama of gods and heroes. Their words carried the story forward, but their humanity was rarely the center of the tale. They were tools of narrative, much as they were tools in real life indispensable, but rarely celebrated. Yet even in these roles, we catch glimpses of something deeper. In Euripides' play Helen, for instance, a slave speaks openly about the hardships of serving another, voicing what might have been the quiet thoughts of thousands of real people. For the brief span of a scene, the mask of comedy or tragedy slips, and we hear an echo of truth. Mythology, too, though rarely focused on slaves, sometimes touched the theme of servitude. Consider the story of Hephaestus, the god of fire and craft. Though a god, he was often mocked, cast out for his deformity, made to serve the other Olympians with his creations. In some ways, his story mirrored the lives of slaves, indispensable for their skill, yet never honored as equals. Another myth tells of Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd of Odysseus in the Odyssey. Though technically a servant, he is portrayed with dignity, kindness, and faithfulness. When Odysseus finally returns, disguised, it is Eumaeus who welcomes him, who shows that even those at the bottom of society could embody virtue. And then there were stories where slaves became the clever tricksters, not unlike figures from folktales across cultures. A witty servant who fools his master, a nurse who hides secrets, a messenger who carries more knowledge than he lets on. These figures were exaggerated, yes, but they carried within them a subtle truth, that intelligence and humanity are not bound by status. We can imagine slaves listening to these plays, perhaps standing at the back of the theater while their masters reclined in better seats. The stage flickers with torches, the chorus chants, the actors' masks stare out at the crowd, and in the words of a fictional slave character, the real ones might hear their own thoughts reflected, even if only for a moment. That recognition could be both comforting and painful comforting because they were seen. Painful because it was only in stories that their cleverness or loyalty was celebrated. It is also worth remembering the theater itself depended on slave labor. Who carried the wood to build the stage? Who sewed the costumes? Who fetched water for the actors? Most likely, it was slaves. So, while the citizens laughed or wept at the stories told, the labor of unseen hands made those performances possible. The line between stage and life blurred. Slaves acted roles in fiction and simultaneously supported the theater in reality. There is something poignant about this duality. In plays, a slave might deliver a clever quip, drawing applause. In life, that same cleverness, if spoken out of turn, could result in punishment. The theater allowed the Greeks to play with boundaries they would never cross in reality. Comedy turned the world upside down for a few hours, but when the play ended, order was restored. The slave went back to silence. Imagine leaving the theater after one of these performances. The marble seats grow cool in the evening air. The crowd disperses down narrow streets lit by flickering lamps. A master talks excitedly about a witty line from the play, laughing with his companions. Behind him, his slave walks quietly, carrying the master's cloak, remembering the same line, but for a different reason. In that moment, two interpretations of the same story coexist, one from above, one from below. That divide is the essence of history, the same events seen through very different eyes. Even myths of gods and heroes could reflect slavery in subtler ways. Heracles, the strongest of all heroes, was famously punished by being made to serve Queen Omphale of Lydia, the image of the great hero wearing women's clothes and spinning wool under her command must have been striking to audiences. To the Greeks, it was comic humiliation. But to a slave, perhaps it whispered another truth. Even the strongest could be forced to serve. Servitude was not natural destiny, it was circumstance, as even gods and heroes could discover. Through stories, the Greeks laughed at slaves, sympathized with them, used them as narrative tools, or elevated them briefly to moral exemplars. And in all of these, we glimpse how deeply slavery was embedded in the cultural imagination. It was not hidden or denied. It was woven into the very fabric of storytelling. If you close your eyes now, imagine the glow of oil lamps in an ancient theater. The crowd leans forward, laughter rippling like waves. A masked actor playing a slave cracks a joke. The chorus bursts into song, and for a heartbeat, the walls between fiction and life shimmer. You might hear, faint beneath the laughter, the unspoken truth that behind every story of freedom and heroism, there were always countless people living lives of quiet bondage. But stories were not the only way slaves left their mark. Their presence filled not only theaters, but also homes, markets, and temples. They were there in the background of philosophy itself, attending the great thinkers whose ideas still shape us today. And what did those philosophers truly think about slavery? Did they justify it, question it, or ignore it? That is where we'll drift next into the calm, paradoxical world of Greek philosophy, where liberty was praised with words written by men, served by slaves. Philosophy. When we think of ancient Greece, it is often the philosophers who come to mind. First, Socrates wandering the agora, Plato teaching in his academy, Aristotle collecting knowledge of the natural world. Their words have shaped how we think about politics, ethics, and even the nature of existence. Yet, woven quietly into their daily lives, often unacknowledged but always present, were slaves. And so we arrive at a curious paradox, the birthplace of lofty ideas about freedom. Reason and justice was also a place where slavery was accepted as natural dot. Let us walk slowly into this paradox. Imagine a young man sitting at Plato's academy, listening intently as the philosopher explains the concept of justice. Around them, olive trees sway in the breeze, cicadas hum in the heat. A slave, perhaps standing just outside, tends to the water jars, filling cups for the students. The irony is heavy. Here is a circle of free men debating the meaning of liberty, while the one serving them has none at all. Plato himself did not argue for the abolition of slavery. His vision of the ideal state in the Republic was hierarchical, with citizens, auxiliaries, and rulers at the top. Slaves did not figure prominently in this imagined utopia. They were assumed as much a part of the social fabric as stone in the city walls. For Plato, the pursuit of justice was about harmony among free citizens, not about extending freedom to all. Aristotle went further, offering one of the most influential and troubling justifications of slavery. In his Politics, he wrote of the natural slave, arguing that some people were destined by nature to serve others. To him, a person lacking the capacity for rational self-direction was better off being guided, even owned, by someone else. These words may sound shocking now, but at the time, they offered a neat philosophical explanation for a practice everyone could see around them. The mines, the workshops, the households all filled with people whose servitude could be justified as natural order. And yet, even as these philosophers explained or accepted slavery, cracks appeared in their logic. Aristotle admitted that sometimes slavery came not from nature, but from war and conquest, where one person was forced to serve another, regardless of ability. That unease lingers in his writing, as if even he knew the neat categories could not contain the messy truth. The Stoics, later on, took a different path. They argued that all human beings shared a spark of divine reason, that in essence, everyone was equal. Epictetus, one of the most famous Stoics, was himself born a slave. His teachings carried the voice of someone who had lived under chains, who knew firsthand the limits and the inner freedoms that came with such a life. For him, true liberty came from mastering the self, not from external conditions. "You may fetter my leg," he said, "but not even Zeus has power over my will." His philosophy turned the experience of slavery into a paradoxical kind of strength. The body may be owned, but the mind remains sovereign. Imagine that idea rippling quietly through a gathering of listeners, many of whom had never considered the inner life of a slave. For a few moments, perhaps, they glimpsed that freedom was not just political but spiritual, that even in the deepest bondage, the human soul could not be fully conquered. And yet, in practical terms, slavery persisted. Even philosophers who spoke of universal reason or the brotherhood of mankind rarely called for systemic change. The convenience, the economic dependency, the cultural acceptance, it was too deeply ingrained. Philosophers could imagine ideal states and perfect forms, but they could not imagine a world without slaves. Picture, if you will, a philosopher reclining at a symposium, debating ethics with his peers. A slave moves silently behind him, pouring watered wine into his cup. The philosopher speaks of virtue, of moderation, of the good life. The slave does not speak at all. Their silence is its own kind of philosophy, a lived experience that no treatise ever fully captured. Even Socrates, that gadfly of Athens, left no record of condemning slavery. His concern was the moral character of the citizen, the pursuit of truth, the examination of life. Perhaps he did not see slaves as part of that equation, or perhaps he accepted their presence as simply the way of the world. It is a sobering thought. The men who questioned everything did not question this. Still, ideas are slippery things. Even when not intended, They can spark unexpected fires. The Stoic emphasis on inner equality would later influence Christian thought, which carried forward the radical notion that in the eyes of God, slave and master were equal. That seed, planted in the soil of philosophy, would grow centuries later into movements that finally challenged slavery as an institution in Greece itself, though the paradox remained. A society that praised freedom and civic participation also relied on unfree labor. Democracy in Athens was vibrant, but it was a democracy only for citizens, excluding women, foreigners, and of course, slaves. The shining ideals of liberty were built on a foundation of servitude. To walk through Athens was to walk through contradiction. Marble temples to freedom, funded by silver, mined by slaves. If you close your eyes, imagine the quiet of the academy at dusk. The last students drift away, their sandals scuffing on the dusty path. Plato remains, deep in thought, perhaps considering the nature of the soul. A slave gathers the empty cups, sweeps the courtyard, and tends the lamp. Two lives, side by side, one celebrated for wisdom, the other forgotten by name. Yet both are thinking beings. Both are human. One recorded, the other erased. And so philosophy leaves us with questions rather than answers. Was slavery natural, as Aristotle claimed? Was freedom an inner state, as Epictetus believed? Or was it simply a social convenience, too comfortable for even the wisest to challenge? These are questions that echo softly through history, reminders that even great thinkers lived within the blind spots of their own time. But philosophy was only one part of Greek culture. Beyond the academy and the agora, there was the daily life of families, households, and the private bonds between masters, mistresses, and the slaves who served them. Those relationships were complex, tangled with affection, resentment, and dependency. To understand them is to see another side of slavery, not just the labor, but the intimacy of life lived in close quarters. And that is where we'll drift next, into the private world of households, where the lines between family and servitude blurred in unexpected ways. Step with me now away from the marble colonnades of philosophy and into the more intimate spaces of Greek homes. The household, or oikos, was the beating heart of Greek life, and for slaves, it was both prison and community. Here, the daily rhythms of cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, and caretaking shaped bonds that were at once tender and suffocating. To understand Greek slavery, we must walk into these homes and listen closely to the quiet. Private relationships between masters, mistresses, children, and the slaves who lived among them that imagine an Athenian household in the soft morning light. The courtyard is shaded by fig trees, the walls painted with simple frescoes. Children run barefoot across the tiles, laughter echoing. But behind that laughter is a nurse, often a slave, chasing after them with patient persistence. These nursemaids were more than caretakers. They were second mothers, often closer to the children than their biological parents. A wealthy woman in Athens might rarely see her own baby in its earliest years, entrusting it instead to the arms of a slave nurse, who fed, bathed, and soothed the child to sleep. Bonds of love were inevitable. A child might cling to the nurse, trust her voice, and weep when she left the room. And yet, that love was always threaded with inequality. The nurse could be punished or sold. She might raise a child from cradle to youth, only to be discarded when no longer needed. Her affection was real, but it existed within chains. Imagine the heartbreak of seeing a child you raised grow into an adult who now calls you servant, who has the power to command you. In those moments, love and servitude coexisted uneasily, tangled in ways neither could fully escape. Households also relied on slaves for the management of daily affairs. A trusted slave might become the steward of a household, managing finances, directing other servants, even negotiating at the marketplace. To hold such responsibility was both privilege and burden. It was trust, but never freedom. At any moment, that trust could vanish, and the steward could find himself beaten for a mistake, or replaced by another. For women of the household, the presence of female slaves was constant. They worked side by side in weaving rooms, spinning wool and linen. Picture the rhythmic creak of looms, the soft whir of spindles. Women and slaves bent together over their tasks. They may have whispered stories to pass the hours, shared small jokes, even confided secrets. And yet, the mistress held authority, deciding whether those same women might one day be sold, separated from friends or family. Friendship could blossom, but it grew on brittle ground. Children, too, were shaped by these relationships. Many grew up believing it was natural to have slaves around, natural to be served. They absorbed lessons not only from their tutors, but from the everyday presence of those who clothed them, fed them, and walked them to school. And sometimes those children grew into adults who freed the slaves they had loved since childhood. Other times they grew into masters who forgot that affection the moment power shifted. Childhood bonds rarely outweighed the habits of culture. Marriage also created complex dynamics. Some masters fathered children with female slaves, willingly or unwillingly. These relationships, unequal by nature, left traces in Greek households. Children born of slaves did not inherit citizenship, though they might live under the same roof as legitimate heirs. Picture the silent tension at a dinner table, where one child reclines as heir, and another, of equal blood, serves food at his elbow. The lines between family and servitude blurred in ways that could never be. Publicly acknowledged. Religion added another layer. Slaves participated in household rituals, tending shrines, pouring libations, offering incense. They prayed alongside their masters, sometimes sincerely, sometimes because it was required. Over time, these shared rituals blurred distinctions. Kneeling together at the same altar, slave and master both whispered to gods for protection, health, and good fortune. And yet, the gods were not equalizers. They were invoked to protect the master's house, which included the slaves only as property. Still, moments of humanity broke through. Imagine a winter evening, the hearth fire glowing in the center of the home. A family reclines, eating warm bread and figs, drinking wine. Slaves serve quietly, but once the meal ends, a child tugs a slave by the hand to sit by the fire. The child begs for a story, and the slave, smiling faintly, begins to weave one, perhaps a tale from their homeland, or a Greek myth retold in their own words. For that brief moment, master and slave share laughter, share wonder, and the walls of hierarchy fade. When the story ends, the wall rises again, but for a heartbeat it was gone. Not all households were warm. Some were harsh, where slaves lived in fear of cruelty from both masters and mistresses. Ancient writers hint at punishments inflicted by jealous wives upon female slaves, or anger vented by masters after bad days. In such homes, intimacy existed only as a means of control, and affection was scarce. Yet even in those places, slaves found ways to connect with one another, to build little families among themselves. Imagine a group of slaves sitting together at night in a storeroom. They share bread, talk in whispers, comfort each other. One tells a story of his homeland's mountains. Another hums a lullaby her mother once sang. Together, they create a fragile family of choice, stitched together from necessity, a reminder that even in captivity, people seek belonging. The household was a place of contradictions, affection and cruelty, trust and betrayal, intimacy and alienation. It was in these private spaces that slavery revealed its most complex face, not just labor and punishment, but love that was always precarious, always shadowed by ownership. If you close your eyes, you might imagine sitting on a cool tile floor in an Athenian home. A lamp flickers above, casting shadows. You hear a child's laughter, a woman's voice scolding gently, the scrape of a broom on stone. In the corner, a slave hung softly, almost to herself, while folding cloth. It is ordinary, almost tender, and yet every sound is framed by the knowledge that one life belongs to another. But what of the slaves who lived not in private homes, but in public spaces, those who labored in the bustling markets, who tended shops, who filled the city streets with their unseen work? To see their world, we must leave the household and wander into the marketplace, the agora, where the public life of Greece unfolded, and where slaves were woven invisibly into the very life of the city. That is where we'll drift next. Let us leave the private courtyards and quiet hearths now, and step into the heart of Greek public life, the agora. Imagine the bustle of an Athenian morning as the sun climbs higher, light glinting off whitewashed walls, and the square filling with voices. The air is thick with scents, freshly baked bread, grilled fish sizzling over charcoal, pungent garlic, figs bursting with sweetness, and the less pleasant odor of livestock penned nearby. Merchants shout their prices. Philosophers gather in shaded corners to argue. Citizens bargain over olives, and threading through it all, almost invisible, are the slaves. The agora was more than a market. It was the hub of the city, a place where politics, religion, business, and gossip all converged. And for every citizen who strolled with dignity, there were slaves carrying baskets, hauling amphorae, sweeping stalls, or standing silently behind their masters. Their presence was so constant, it faded into the background, like the buzz of cicadas in summer. Picture a slave balancing a wide basket of figs on his shoulders, a strap digging into his skin. He weaves carefully through the crowd, mindful not to stumble. A boy runs by and jostles him. A few figs tumble to the dust, and he stoops quickly, gathering them up before his master notices. No one offers to help. Around him, citizens haggle over prices with loud, confident voices, their gestures wide and emphatic. The slave moves silently, always watching, always cautious. Others worked as stall assistants, managing the goods that kept Athens alive. A potter's slave might arrange clay vessels in neat rows, his hands streaked with reddish dust. A fishmonger's slave might gut fish, scales flashing in the morning light. A baker's slave might knead dough endlessly, forearms slick with sweat. Some even sold goods on behalf of their masters, trusted enough to handle coins and make transactions. It was a peculiar kind of freedom to move through the market, to handle money, but still within the tether of ownership. The agora also revealed how closely slavery intertwined with commerce. Enslaved scribes copied contracts, kept records, and managed accounts. In a world where literacy was not universal, a literate slave was invaluable. Imagine one seated at a small table, a wax tablet before him, stylus scratching steadily as he records debts. The master may boast of his business acumen, but it is the slave's hand that keeps the numbers straight. Ironically, the agora was also where slaves themselves could be bought and sold. Somewhere amid the stalls of food and pottery, there were corners where human beings were displayed like goods. Foreigners captured in war, children taken by pirates, debtors sold into bondage, all lined up, inspected, priced. A buyer might pinch an arm to test muscle, ask about skills, peer into eyes as though examining livestock. For the slaves on display, the bustling life of the market must have seemed both vivid and terrifying, a cacophony of freedom all around them, while they stood waiting to lose theirs. Even in the busiest market, though, there were moments of quiet rebellion. A slave trusted to buy goods might take a longer route, stealing a few extra breaths of freedom in the crowded streets. Another might pocket a fig or olive, a tiny theft unnoticed among the abundance. These acts did not topple systems, but they gave small tastes of self-assertion, reminders that a human heart still beat beneath the tunic of servitude. Slaves also served as messengers in the Agra, darting through the crowds with errands. In a way, they were the arteries of the city, carrying news, goods, and letters. Picture one running from stall to stall, sandals slapping on the stones, sweat shining on his brow. He carries a folded wax tablet sealed with string, perhaps news of a business deal or an invitation to dinner. He moves fast, because delay could mean punishment. Yet he also glimpses the whole city, every stall, every citizen, every whisper of rumor. In that way, slaves were among the most informed people in Athens, though their knowledge was rarely acknowledged. Entertainment, too, spilled into the Agra. Storytellers drew crowds, jugglers performed tricks, musicians played their flutes and lyres. Slaves carrying bundles might pause briefly to watch, allowing themselves a moment of laughter before moving on. Think of a boy, arms full of pottery, grinning as a performer pretends to juggle and drop his own sandals. For that moment, he is simply human, caught in the spell of humor, even if only until the master's voice calls him back. And beyond the commerce and bustle, the Agora was political ground. Citizens debated laws, gathered for assemblies, and made decisions that shaped the city. Slaves stood nearby, holding cloaks, waiting with food, guarding belongings. They were close enough to hear the debates about freedom, justice, and democracy, but never close enough to speak. Imagine standing in the blazing sun, listening as men argue passionately about liberty, while you hold their sandals in silence. A contradiction is sharp, almost cruel, and yet it was the daily reality of Athens. As days stretched on, the market began to thin. Merchants packed up their goods, citizens returned home. The smells of cooking fires replaced those of garlic and fish. Slaves gathered the leftovers of the day crumbs swept from stalls, bruised fruit discarded in baskets. Some brought these scraps back to their masters. Others tucked them away for themselves, or shared them with fellow servants. The Agora emptied, but for slaves, the work of carrying, cleaning, and tending continued. The public life of Greece depended on this unseen labor. Every speech delivered in the assembly, every deal struck in the market, every loaf baked or amphora sold was supported by the steady presence of enslaved hands. To walk through the Agora was to walk through a paradox of freedom built on servitude, commerce built on human lives treated as goods. Close your eyes and imagine the Agora at sunset. The stalls are empty, the square quiet, only a few dogs prowling for scraps. A slave lingers for a moment, sweeping dust from the stones. He looks up at the sky, streaked with orange and purple, and breathes deeply. For a heartbeat, the air belongs to him. The beauty of the twilight belongs to him, even if nothing else does. Then he turns, gathers his broom, and disappears into the shadows of the city. But life in the city was not the whole story. Beyond Athens and the Agora, in the countryside and the estates, slaves lived under different rhythms, working the land and facing hardships shaped by the seasons. What was it like to be bound not to the marketplace, but to the soil itself, to live under the vast sky of rural Greece? That is where we'll wander next. We leave behind the marble columns and crowded chatter of the Agora, and we step into the wider countryside of Greece. Here the air smells different, sharper, clearer, with the resin of pine trees and the earthy scent of tilled soil drifting under the wide sky. Rural life, slower in appearance, was no less demanding, and for slaves it carried its own burdens. To be bound to the land was to be bound to endless cycles of labor, where seasons themselves became the master. Imagine walking along a dusty track through the Attic countryside. Olive groves stretch in every direction, their silvery leaves whispering in the breeze. Vines twist up their trellises, heavy with grapes in autumn. Wheat fields ripple gold under the summer sun. Behind this beauty lies relentless toil, carried out day after day by slaves whose lives were measured not in hours, but in harvests. The work began early. Before dawn, A farm slave might already be leading oxen to plow, the wooden yoke creaking against their necks. The soil, dry and stubborn, resisted every stroke, and sweat slicked the skin before the sun even rose. In spring, planting was the focus, dropping seeds carefully into furrows, covering them, praying for rain. In summer, tending vines and olives consumed the days, pruning branches, clearing weeds, guarding against pests. In autumn, harvest arrived, long hours spent cutting grain with sickles or climbing trees to pluck olives by hand. And in winter, maintenance work filled the time-mending tools, repairing stone walls, hauling firewood. Picture the feel of an olive harvest. A group of slaves gathered beneath the trees, cloths spread on the ground. They beat the branches gently with sticks, olives raining down like dark green hail. The sound is rhythmic, like rain on a roof. Their fingers ache from their repetition. Their backs bend from stooping to gather the fruit. The oil that results will feed the household, light lamps, and bring wealth to the master. The slaves themselves might taste only a drizzle, and only when permitted. Life in the countryside carried isolation. In the city, slaves at least saw crowds, festivals, and markets. On estates, they often lived in small huts near the fields, far from towns. Their community was mostly other slaves, their conversations the only relief in endless landscapes. Loneliness pressed in, broken only by the chatter of birds or the rustle of wind through wheat. Imagine lying on straw at night, looking up at stars so clear they seemed close enough to touch, and feeling both awe and aching distance from the life you once knew. Punishment in rural estates could be harsher too. Without the eyes of the city to moderate behavior, masters often wielded power more cruelly. Overseers with whips patrolled the fields, ensuring work never slowed. Stories survive of slaves chained to millstones, forced to grind grain endlessly, or sent to quarries to cut stone under the burning sun. In such places, hope of escape was slim. Villages might notice strangers, and mountains were harsh refuges. Many tried nonetheless, their footprints disappearing into the dust. Yet there were moments of fragile humanity, even here. At harvest festivals, slaves sometimes shared in the celebration. When the last sheaf of wheat was cut, or when new wine was pressed, music filled the air. Flutes played, drums pounded, and food and drink were shared more generously. For one night, laughter and dancing softened the weight of servitude. The morning, of course, brought work again, but the memory of music lingered like a spark in the heart. Rural slaves also built bonds with the land itself. Forced though their work was, they came to know the soil intimately, its moods and rhythms. A man might sense rain in the wind before it arrived. A woman might recognize which olive trees bore sweeter fruit. Their knowledge was deep, even if it was not valued as theirs. In another life, they might have been farmers of their own land. Instead, their wisdom fed another's wealth. That one can imagine the small acts of resistance here too. A seed pocketed instead of planted. A handful of grapes eaten under the shade of vines. A brief rest stolen under an olive tree while the overseer's back was turned. In isolation, these moments were tiny, but they were proof of selfhood. Even in the wide silence of the countryside, the human will sought to carve out space for itself. Religion followed them into the fields as well. Shrines to Demeter, goddess of grain, or Dionysus, god of wine, dotted the rural landscape. Slaves participated in offerings, pouring libations, scattering barley, praying for harvest. Perhaps they prayed also for freedom, slipping their own hopes into the ritual words. To look up at a sky, the same for master and slave alike, must have carried a bittersweet weight. Imagine standing in a field at dusk, the last sheaves tied into bundles. The sky glows pink and gold, the cicadas hum their chorus, and the air cools. Slaves walk slowly back toward their huts, shoulders heavy, feet dragging. Yet one lingers, gazing at the horizon. For a moment, the wide land feels almost like home, even though it is not. That fleeting sense of belonging is stolen, fragile, but real. Rural life was hard, but it was also where the backbone of Greek economy lay. The olives, the grapes, the wheat, all produced by slave labor, were the lifeblood of trade and sustenance. To eat bread in Athens, to drink wine at a symposium, to light a lamp in a temple, was to partake in the work of unseen hands in distant fields. The city glittered with marble, but its foundation was tilled soil. Close your eyes, and you might hear it. The scrape of the sickle against wheat, the crack of branches as olives fall, the low murmur of voices at dusk. The countryside is quiet, but within that quiet are lives of endurance, stories never told, except in whispers carried by the wind. But life in rural Greece was not the end of the story. Slavery reached beyond fields and households into darker places, the mines and quarries, where work was harsher still, and survival was a daily question. What was it like in those depths, far from sun and sky? That is where we'll travel next, into the shadows of stone and silver, where the labor of slaves carved both wealth and misery from the earth. Now we step downward, away from sunlight and open air, into the mines and quarries of Greece. If the fields were demanding and the households suffocating, the mines were something darker still. Here, slavery was stripped to its harshest form, where labor gnawed at both body and spirit, and survival was not guaranteed. The silver mines of Laurion, south of Athens, were infamous. Athens' wealth, its fleets, its glittering temples, all leaned heavily on the silver dug from those rocky hills. And it was slaves who descended into the earth to hack it free. Imagine walking down into a narrow shaft carved by pickaxes. The air is heavy with dust, every breath gritty in the throat. Oil lamps flicker faintly, casting shadows that dance against jagged walls. The tunnel is so low that you must crawl, knees and elbows scraping against stone. Somewhere ahead, the sound of hammer on rock echoes like a heartbeat. Children were often used in these spaces. Small bodies fit into tight tunnels where adults could not reach. Picture a boy, barely past childhood, crawling with a sack tied around his waist, filling it with broken chunks of ore. His hands are raw, his skin streaked with sweat and dirt, his breath short in the stale air. He drags the sack back toward the surface, where older slaves sort and crush the ore. The rhythm repeats endlessly, day after day. Work in quarries was no kinder. Slaves cut marble for temples, chiseling blocks under the blazing sun. The stone was dazzlingly bright, reflecting heat until it burned the eyes. Muscles strained with each strike of hammer against chisel. Dust filled the air, coating hair and skin, creeping into lungs. The sound was constant, hammer, chisel, stone cracking. Out of this punishing labor came the marble that still stands today in ruins admired by millions. But the hands that freed those stones from earth remain nameless. Punishment in the mines could be brutal. Overseers carried whips, and chains were not uncommon. Some slaves were shackled to prevent escape, working with iron biting their ankles. For those caught stealing ore, the sentence could be death. And yet, theft was tempting, because a handful of silver might be traded secretly for food, or tucked away in a desperate plan for freedom. Imagine pausing deep in a mine tunnel. The lamp sputters, smoke curling upward. The air feels close, almost alive with silence. You hear only the faint drip of water somewhere in the darkness. In that moment, you are aware of how far you are from the sky, how completely you are enclosed. For the slave, that awareness was constant a reminder that even the earth itself seemed to press down his master. And still, life persisted. Slaves formed bonds in the darkness, whispering stories during brief rests, sharing stolen bites of bread. They comforted one another, sang fragments of songs from faraway homelands, found laughter even in the dust. These were fragile lifelines, but they mattered. To share a joke in the black belly of the earth was to insist that you were still human, not just a tool. Accidents were frequent. Tunnels collapsed, crushing workers beneath tons of stone. The unlucky died instantly. The trapped might suffocate in darkness, their cries fading, while others labored helplessly nearby. For those who survived, scars, broken bones, and ruined lungs marked their bodies. And still the overseers demanded more. The city's wealth depended on their suffering, and so the work continued. Even philosophers, those who mused about justice and the good life, benefited from the silver minted from Lorien. Citizens spent that wealth on temples, on plays, on symposiums, where they debated virtue. Democracy itself was funded by silver dug from the ground by people who had no say in that democracy. Every coin stamped with an Athenian owl carried the hidden weight of lives lost underground. The mines and quarries remind us of the bluntest truth. Slavery was not just service, but exploitation of the body until it broke. And yet, even in such depths, humanity refused to vanish entirely. A man might carve a small mark into the stone, a secret sign that he was there. A child might hum softly while carrying ore, a thread of melody in the dark. These small acts are invisible in history books, but they echo if we listen closely. Close your eyes and imagine standing at the mouth of the Lorien mines at dusk. The sky is streaked with fading light, while below, tunnels still glow with faint lamps. Slaves emerge one by one, faces gray with dust, eyes rimmed red, bodies stooped. They walk slowly toward their huts, every step heavy. And yet, overhead, the first stars appear bright, untouchable, unbent by human suffering. Perhaps a man looks up at those stars and whispers the name of his homeland, carrying memory as the one thing no overseer can strip away. The mines are the starkest reminder of what it meant to be property in Greece. But life above ground carried its own forms of constraint. Beyond labor, beyond punishment, there were rules and laws boundaries drawn not just by masters, but by the state. Slaves lived within a web of legal restrictions, their identities shaped as much by politics as by chains. And so, in the next part, we'll step back into the city to see what laws governed these lives, and how the state itself codified servitude. Let us drift back now from the tunnels of the mines into the polished courtyards of the city, where another kind of control took hold. Not the whip or the overseer's bark, but the law. For Greek slaves, even the structure of the state was a cage. Every society builds rules about who belongs and who does not, and in Athens, Sparta, and elsewhere, those rules made it very clear. Slaves were outside the circle of freedom. In Athens, the law was precise in some places and vague in others. Slaves were not citizens. They had no vote, no place in the assembly, no voice in the courts, except under the will of their masters. They could not legally marry, though they might live in family-like bonds. They could not own property, though some were allowed to handle money or even save small sums. Their legal existence was, in essence, that of an extension of someone else's will. And yet, Athens was complicated. Unlike some societies, Athenian law did recognize certain protections for slaves. A master could not kill his slave without consequence. Such an act was technically murder, though the penalty was often far less severe than if the victim were free. The city also had sanctuaries, such as the Temple of Theseus, where runaway slaves could seek refuge. There, they might request a change of master, claiming they had been mistreated. Imagine the desperation that would drive someone to flee to a temple, risking punishment if caught, kneeling before the altar and begging for the protection of a god. In court. Slaves could testify, but only under torture. The Greeks believed a slave's word was unreliable unless extracted by pain. A chilling reflection of how truth itself was seen through the lens of power. Picture the scene. A trial unfolding, citizens arguing passionately, while in a side chamber, a slave is questioned with lash or iron, his cries considered the sound of truth being pulled from flesh. To the Greeks, this was justice. To us, it feels like cruelty draped in ritual. Sparta, of course, was another world entirely. There the enslaved population was the Helots, conquered people bound to the land, forced to farm for their Spartan masters. They outnumbered the Spartans many times over, and for that reason, Spartan law was built on fear and control. Each year, young Spartan men were formally allowed expected, even to terrorize Helots, keeping them subdued through violence. Imagine living under such a law, knowing that at any moment, a knock at the door might not be a neighbor, but armed men sent to remind you of your place with brutality. Helots were essential to Spartan life, but they were never allowed to forget their subjugation. Elsewhere in Greece, laws varied, but the pattern remained. Slaves existed as property, with only fragments of legal recognition. Some cities allowed slaves to manage businesses, to appear in public on errands, even to save money toward freedom. But none offered equality. Their lives were circumscribed by rules written to ensure their labor remained available. Their voices subdued. And yet, within those laws, cracks appeared. A slave who managed to save enough money often, by permission of his master, could sometimes buy freedom. The process of manumission was itself a legal ritual. In Athens, a master might bring the slave to a temple and declare him free before the gods, sometimes recording the act on stone inscriptions. Picture that moment. A man stands trembling, his master's hand on his shoulder, words spoken aloud transforming him from property into person. Freedom was fragile, and often came with obligations to remain a loyal client of the former master. But it was freedom nonetheless. Still, the law reminded freedmen of their limits. They did not become full citizens. They carried restrictions on whom they could marry, what offices they could hold, where they could speak. Their children might inherit fuller rights, but the shadow of servitude clung to them for generations. Freedom was possible, but it was never complete. The presence of slaves even shaped laws for citizens. Because slaves existed, citizenship was defined more sharply. To be a citizen was to not be a slave, to stand inside the circle of rights. The contrast gave meaning. Imagine a citizen walking into the assembly, proud of his freedom to vote. That freedom shone brighter in his mind precisely because others nearby had none. The law built identity by drawing lines of exclusion. There were also laws about runaway slaves. If caught, they could be branded, their bodies marked with scars that told the world they had tried to flee. A single branded letter burned into the skin could follow a person for life, making even the thought of escape dangerous. And yet, people still tried. The risk of punishment was terrible, but the pull of freedom was stronger. If you close your eyes, you might imagine standing in the shadow of a temple inscription, reading the carved record of a manumission. The letters are shallow, worn by centuries, but they tell of a slave once freed. His name, his master's name, the gods called as witnesses. It is a small story, a sliver of hope carved in stone. Around it, countless unrecorded lives remain silent. But this one line tells us, freedom, though rare, was possible. The law, then, was not just chains, but also the faint keys to unlock them. It defined lives, bound people, but also sometimes, carefully, allowed release. And through those legal rituals, we see how Greece balanced its contradictions. A democracy built on denial. A philosophy of freedom that tolerated chains. A law that recognized humanity only by degrees. But life under law was not only about chains and freedom. It was also about what people believed in their hearts. Religion, ritual, and the whisper of gods shaped how slaves endured their lives. What did the gods mean to someone in bondage? Were they cruel, indifferent, or sources of hope? In the next chapter, we'll walk into temples and festivals to see how faith wove through the lives of the enslaved, offering both consolation and control. Religion in ancient Greece was everywhere. It pulsed in the festivals, in the offerings at street corner shrines, in the smell of incense rising from temples. For slaves, who lived with little control over their own bodies, the world of the gods offered both a burden and a fragile comfort. To believe, to pray, to hope, these were not freedoms guaranteed by law, but inner acts that could not always be taken away. And so, the life of a Greek slave was stitched through with rituals of faith, where devotion could be both a tool of control and a whisper of solace. Picture a household shrine, small and humble, placed near the hearth. A lamp flickers, its smoke curling faintly upward. The master pours a libation of wine, offers bread or fruit, and speaks words to the household gods. Standing nearby, a slave tends the fire, places offerings on the altar, perhaps recites prayers at the master's command. To the free family, this act affirms identity and continuity. To the slave, it might feel like another task, yet even within it, there is space for personal thought. Perhaps as the master calls to Zeus or Athena, the slave silently thinks of their own gods from a homeland far away. In the quiet flicker of flame, two kinds of prayer mingle. One commanded, one chosen. Festivals, however, drew everyone into their orbit. Take the Panathenea, Athens' great festival for the goddess Athena. Streets filled with processions, music, and dancing. Citizens carried torches. Maidens wove the grand peplous robe for the goddess, and sacrifices filled the air with the scent of roasting meat. Slaves were not absent from this. They wove, they carried, they cooked, they cleaned. But they also, for once, shared in the abundance. Festivals often brought feasts where even the lowest received portions of meat, honey cakes, or wine. Imagine the joy of tasting food, usually reserved for masters, the sweetness of honey melting on the tongue, the savory richness of lamb. For a day, the gods leveled the feast table. The festival of Dionysus was another moment when boundaries blurred. The god of wine, theater, and ecstasy was celebrated with processions, masks, and plays. Slaves helped prepare the stages, guided animals for sacrifice, carried jars of wine. And yet, when the plays began, they too could watch, at least from the edges. Laughter and tragedy poured into the air, stories unfolding that sometimes even mocked masters or elevated the cleverness of slaves. To hear one's own station reflected in drama, however exaggerated, was a form of recognition. However fleeting. Religion also carried darker duties. Sacrifices required preparation, and it was often slaves who held the animals, sharpened the knives, gathered the wood for altars. The smell of blood, the cries of goats or bulls, the solemn chants, all of this they witnessed firsthand. For the masters, sacrifice reaffirmed the bond between humans and gods. For slaves, it was another reminder of their position, essential but uncelebrated, always present but rarely honored. And yet, even within Greek religion, glimmers of inclusion existed. Certain cults, such as those of Dionysus or the mystery rites of Eleusis, were open to slaves as well as free people. Imagine slipping into the initiation halls at Eleusis, the torches casting long shadows, the air alive with secrecy and awe. In those mysteries, all initiates, slave or citizen, stood equal before the gods, bound by the same ritual silence. The promise of life after death, of some hidden truth revealed, was given to all alike. For a slave, this must have been staggering. In a world that measured worth by freedom, here was a place where the soul was counted as equal. The presence of foreign-born slaves also colored Greek religion. Thracians, Lydians, Syrians, Egyptians all brought their own deities and customs. In crowded quarters at night, whispers of those gods persisted. Perhaps a Thracian woman sang softly to the moon goddess Bendis. Perhaps a man from Lydia prayed secretly to Cybele, the Great Mother. Over time, some of these foreign gods found their way into Greek worship itself, blending cultures in quiet, unnoticed ways. Slaves, though voiceless in politics, became carriers of spiritual exchange. Even small superstitions mattered. Amulets carved from bone, knots tied in cords, whispered charms to ward off sickness or bad luck. These circulated among slaves as much as among the free. Imagine a young servant tucking a tiny charm under her tunic before heading to the fields, feeling the faint reassurance that something, somewhere, might protect her. The overseer might see only a necklace. She feels a shield, but religion also reinforced hierarchy. Masters might remind slaves that the gods had decreed their station, that order was divine. Aristotle's claim of natural slavery resonated with such thinking. To question slavery was to question the order of the cosmos, and so temples and rituals often served to cement obedience. Standing at an altar, a slave might be told that Zeus himself sanctioned their servitude. Faith could soothe, but it could also bind. Close your eyes and picture a festival night. Torches line the streets, flutes and drums echo, garlands of flowers swing from balconies. The smell of roasted meat fills the air, and cups of wine pass from hand to hand. In the crowd, slaves laugh quietly, tasting freedom in the mingling noise. For once, no one notices who is serving and who is served. Under the stars, beneath the gaze of the gods, all are swept into the same tide of celebration. Tomorrow, chains of custom return, but tonight there is a brief equality in joy.religion. Then was a paradox for slaves. It was duty, burden, and control, yet also comfort, community, and even hope. It bound them to their masters, but it also gave them secret places of freedom in prayer, in song, in whispered stories of gods who might see them not as property, but as souls. And as the festivals ended, as the smoke from sacrifices drifted upward and the city returned to silence, slaves carried on. They had touched joy, if only in passing. They had whispered their prayers, both commanded and chosen. They had looked to the heavens and wondered if perhaps the gods, in their mysterious ways, understood. But as the night grows quiet again, and we near the end of our wandering, one question lingers. What does it all mean to us now? Why revisit the silence of those long-gone lives? And what might we carry into our own? In the final part, we'll reflect on the echoes of Greek slavery in the present, drawing this journey to a close with calm remembrance and a soft wish for rest. And so, we come to the quiet end of our journey. We have walked through the crowded streets of Athens, tasted the coarse bread of a slave's table, descended into the dark mines of Lorien, and lingered by the hearth where stories and whispers softened the weight of chains. We have stood in theaters where slaves were mocked in comedy and dignified in tragedy, and in temples where both masters and servants raised their eyes to the same gods. Now, as the lamps burn low, it is time to reflect, to let these echoes settle gently in our minds. The story of slavery in Greece is not a story of heroes or victories. It is a story of millions of forgotten lives, of hands that labored without recognition, of voices that history rarely recorded, of eyes that watched freedom all around them, but could never grasp it fully. And yet, by looking closely, we can still feel their presence. It lingers in the marble stones of temples, in the silver coins stamped with owls, in the plays still read and performed. For every glittering artifact of Greek civilization, there was a shadow behind it, the shadow of someone who worked unseen. It is tempting to ask, why did they accept it? Why did slavery persist so long in a culture that prized freedom so highly? The truth is that for those born into it, there was little choice. Resistance came in small ways, through humor, through stolen food, through whispered prayers. But the system was vast, deeply rooted, and sustained by war, economy, and tradition. For citizens, slavery was not just tolerated, but normalized, justified by philosophy, law, and religion. That is perhaps the most sobering lesson, that even a society devoted to beauty and wisdom could blind itself to cruelty. And yet, even in bondage, life had meaning. Slaves laughed, loved, dreamed, and prayed. They carried stories from distant homelands. They raised children not their own. They wove knowledge and skills into the fabric of Greek society. They lived, and by living, they left marks invisible to the eye, but enduring in spirit. What can we take from this now, lying in our own time, listening in the dark? Perhaps it is the reminder that freedom is precious, and that societies, even brilliant ones, can be blind to injustice in their midst. Perhaps it is the recognition that dignity survives even under chains, that the human heart can find ways to resist, to hope, to sing, no matter the weight upon it. Imagine yourself now, lying back, eyes closed, drifting. Picture the olive groves under moonlight, the hush of an Athenian night, the faint sound of sandals on stone. Somewhere, in a quiet courtyard, a slave curls up on a straw mat, weary but alive, dreaming of a distant homeland. Somewhere else, another kneels before a small altar, whispering prayers into the dark. Somewhere in a mine, a man carves a tiny mark into the rock, saying without words, "I was here, Dot, as you breathe deeply. Let those images soften." Think of how their lives, though erased in so many ways, ripple into ours. Every history carries both brilliance and shadow. To remember both is to honor truth. And so, as we close tonight, remember that beauty and suffering often walk side by side. The temples of Athens gleamed because unseen hands built them. The democracy that inspired the world rested on voices silenced. To study history is to hold both truths at once, gently, without flinching. Dot, as you drift toward sleep, let your thoughts grow quiet. The story is finished, but its echoes remain, like the faint hum of cicadas in summer air. You are safe here, wrapped in calm, listening to the soft unraveling of time. Dot, if this brought you peace. Consider subscribing so we can take more of these journeys together, slow and quiet, through the forgotten corners of history. Comment where you're listening from tonight. I love seeing how far this sleepy little community reaches. And if you'd like, share this with someone who thinks they'd survive a day in ancient times. Let them see just how heavy the past could be. Dot, as you rest. Carry this thought with you. Beauty changes, civilizations rise and fall, but the need to be seen, to be remembered, never does. And tonight, by listening, you have seen them, if only for a little while. Good night. May your dreams be gentle, and your sleep deep.